Old Nicky Cave comes swinging back into the spotlight with a new double album that continues his exceptional run of somber experimental rock material in the 2010s, but not the nutty, punky kind of experimental rock that rattle your bones, pumps your ears full of volcanic ash, more like the melancholic, ethereal kind that teeters the line between Jean-Michel Jarre and Leonard Cohen. Basically, ambient new age instrumentals, but with odd contemporary elements that feel suited towards Cave's newfound deep-voiced ramblings about the metaphysical makeup of existence itself. Things got thrown completely off for the man after a horrendous accident in which his son passed away, leading to the recollection of self in the gruesome and unapologetic face of loss. Cave is not just a poet, but also a cool poet, so the idea of him humming over slow droning actually ended up being a bit more captivating than it might sound on paper. Because Skeleton Tree was so good, and not just good for very distinct reasons, the fact that Ghosteen carries on from this embrace of long-form, droning new age instrumentation only seems like a natural part of the flow. It's a double disc album too. Usually when that happens I freeze over, but Nick Cave is invincible and absolutely nailed a 2-chapter album a decade and a half prior. Ghosteen is, and I cannot stress this enough, in concept an excellent album. Part of me just wants to keep describing it in abstract metaphors that would be perfect for some kind of biblical novel, maybe in the style of The Quietus or something. Reading over these lyrics on their own reminds me of the spark in Cave's imagination that allows him to weave these stories that evoke the scope of the world, but ultimately still speaks this tale that pertains to his personal experience and his perspective of the said world. In the context of this decade, there has never been a more perfect album to make. Essentially an album to tell us, eye to eye, everything that Cave has learned. There is a beautiful fusion of our world and the fantastical kingdom that we all picture in our heads when we think about fucking paradise or something. On Spinning Song, the first track with its first words being about the king of rock and roll himself, Elvis Presley. Even if you don't care about Elvis, you still get an idea of the cultural significance that he had, and this extends to such a lavish description of how wide-reaching his legacy was. Cave brings our attention to detail as he unravels the scene moving in front of us, as if he's in control of the camera in a movie. When Elvis dies, the entire scene seems to collapse. It's like that thing people say, everybody knows where they were when Michael Jackson died, because it was such a huge moment about somebody with such a universal touch, pun not intended. The scene collapses back down to earth where you can just feel everything is still. It's there in the music too. There's a news broadcast on the radio and you're just listening to it at the kitchen table. The magic bubble has popped, but the feather from one of the birds up there keeps spinning upwards like the last puff of magic to keep with us. It keeps this man and his story living on in our memories, the stories that we pass on to each other. Cave manages to have this moment of peace as he repeats to himself that we all have our end eventually, but we also all have our little legacies and memories to leave behind with people, our own feathers that spin upwards. After Skeleton Tree, an album where Cave literally mourns his son on record, this seems like an apt conclusion, and that's just one bloody song. Cave just does this amazing job of building up such valiant, gorgeous, fantastical imagery before abruptly fading it back into our earthly reality. What should be such a triumphant image of horses and their manes is instead described as a very still and mundane yet still appreciable portrait of nature, which he then contrasts, or better yet, complements with our daily mundane travel on the 5:30 train. For something so seemingly otherworldly, it's actually extremely down to earth, as if to reason with us at eye level, because this is something we should be able to connect with universally. Night Raid is a song about the birth of his twins and a recapturing of that very moment. In context, that's powerful, like he's celebrating his son's life in spite of the tragedy, which ties into the conclusive theme that ultimately what we have left on Earth is just what we have. That sounds obvious and silly, but think about it, how easily we take that for granted and how reassuring a statement that can be when you've lost something. It doesn't mean you're going to hurt any less, a very grounding reminder that's carried by the story of Kisa and the Buddha retold on the closing track, but it can certainly be a means of recalibrating and moving forward nonetheless. On Fireflies, Cave describes stars that we deem visible, but they've actually long since died out. Their memory lives on in spite of the fact that they've physically dissipated long since. This is the sort of thing you learn over a long period of time, which is probably the reason this album is so fucking long. Yeah, I'm not gonna lie, the poetic quality is astounding, and even if these were familiar sentiments to some people, surely you'd have to appreciate the gravity and the control Cave has over his language and where he leads your imagination. Unfortunately, because it is a Nick Cave album, and specifically a 2010's Nick Cave album, he's delivering them like a decrepit vampire over bland new age instrumentals that seem to go on forever. Spinning Song is stagnant, Night Raid chimes hollow hollowly like the sound fonts in a DOS game I used to play when I was 8. Waiting for You sounds like a boring retread of Boatman's Call piano balladry, but wispier like the strands of hair that you try to brush out of your eyes on a windy day. Moments where Cave is backed by group vocals give this album the sense of universal touch it actually needs, but in between, its use of paper-thin drone soundscapes collapses the potential of those sentiments into this airy mush, like a pavlova at the back of a lecture theatre with disabled air conditioning units. I saw the cover artwork and I thought it looked like a Steam game, but in a decent way it sounded like one too. Partway in I thought it was playing Thomas Was Alone, only fitting that there's a 5-minute loading screen at the beginning. Bright Horses and Sun Forest are the two tracks on disc 1 that I couldn't resist getting musically swept up in the sense that they have some legitimate sense of gravity with the way that their lavish instrumentation swells, but only lightly like lapping waves on the shore. There's a real cathartic inspo to hearing Cave go into his higher register, almost like an untapped surprise to help him truly release himself. It's a bit like the first track on Southeastern by Jason Isbell, where that sudden vocal lift is unexpected but feels like an important moment. That's the clincher, it feels important. This is a feeling of anticipation and climax that's reached once again on the inspiring title track, and I don't even mind that Cave trails off into the dust at the end like a bit of an epilogue, but of course the remainder of the album quickly reminds me again of why I didn't feel the rest of it, because the instrumentals simply aren't very good. I respect Ghosteen, in case you forgot that I spent half the review praising what it represents. I just didn't, quote unquote, fitted within another quote unquote for good cushioning, enjoy it. The prospect of gorgeous string arrangements and poetry recited over new age synths that ironically sound very old is a little bit like having the world's best seasoned, spicy, nourishing guac over a stale crusket.